5:47 a.m., July 8th, 2026. Port of Houston, Texas. 14 federal vehicles moved in coordinated silence along the service road at Barber's Cut Terminal. No sirens, no flashing lights, headlights off. Estimated asset value aboard the vessels at dock, $2, $3 billion. Inside the lead vehicle, Special Agent Daria Marchetti of Homeland Security Investigations checked her earpiece for the third time in 4 minutes. The warrant in her jacket pocket covered 7 tankers docked at Barber's Cut. 200 miles east, at the port of Savannah, a mirror team was already in position. 3 time zones away, agents at the port of Long Beach were waiting on a single word. That word would come at 5:51 a.m. But the operation almost didn't reach that morning. It nearly collapsed 3 weeks before the warrants were ever signed, when the one person who built the evidentiary foundation for the entire case dropped out of contact for 11 days. The financial trail that brought 14 tankers into federal custody and froze $340 million in U.S. held assets. Didn't start in a federal building or a task force conference room. It started in a mid-rise office on the western edge of Houston's energy corridor on a Tuesday afternoon in late March 2026, when a compliance analyst named Sandra Pruitt pulled up the onboarding files for 6 new maritime clients and noticed something wrong. Same registered agent, same address, same mailbox suite in Wilmington, Delaware. 6 separate companies. 6 supposedly independent tanker operators. 1 address. Sandra Pruitt had worked in marine insurance compliance for 9 years. She had reviewed thousands of onboarding files. The registered agent address alone wasn't unusual. Delaware LLCs share registered agent offices routinely. But 6 newly onboarded clients, all sourced through the same 2 brokers, all within a 40-day window, all listing the same suite number in the same Wilmington building. That was a pattern. She flagged it internally. Her supervisor told her to document it and move on. She documented it, and then filed a suspicious activity report with FinCEN. The SAR was filed on March 24th, 2026. It contained 9 pages of supporting documentation, including the 6 client onboarding packets, the broker identification records, and a comparative chart Pruitt had assembled herself on her own time. She had worked on it across 3 evenings at her kitchen table, cross-referencing public corporate registry data with her firm's internal records, building a timeline that showed the 6 entities had been onboarded in a sequence so compressed, no more than 6 days between the first and last, that the odds of it being coincidental commercial activity kept shrinking the more she looked at it. She didn't know, at the moment she submitted that report, that 2 of the brokers named in her documentation were already on a watch list maintained by the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control. She found out 48 hours later, when 2 HSI agents showed up at her office and asked to speak privately. The investigation that would become Operation Dry Harbor formally began on March 26, 2026. That was the date of the first interagency coordination call between HSI, OFAC, the U.S. Coast Guard's 7th District, and FinCEN's intelligence unit. The call lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. By the end of it, the scope of what Sandra Pruitt had stumbled into had already grown beyond what anyone on that initial call had expected. The 6 companies in Pruitt's original SAR were the visible layer. Beneath them were 8 more. 14 shell companies in total, incorporated across 3 jurisdictions: the Marshall Islands, Panama, and Belize. All 14 were registered between November 2024 and September 2025. All 14 listed nominee directors. Individuals whose names appeared on incorporation documents, but who had no operational role, no ownership stake, and in several cases, no apparent knowledge that their names were being used. All 14 were ultimately traced through beneficial ownership analysis conducted jointly by HSI financial investigators and OFAC's sanctions enforcement team to 2 principals: Iranian petroleum brokers Farhad Jalili and Mehdi Kavusi, both of whom appeared on OFAC's specially designated nationals list. Jalili had been sanctioned in 2021 for facilitating oil sales on behalf of entities controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Kavusi had been designated in 2023 in connection with a network that moved Venezuelan crude through intermediary jurisdictions to evade U.S. sanctions. Both men were outside U.S. jurisdiction. Both remained beyond reach, what was inside U.S. jurisdiction. And what Operation Dry Harbor was built to reach were the American facilitators. The network had operated undetected for 19 months. The 14 tankers moved petroleum products across the Gulf of Mexico, primarily between Mexican ports, Caribbean transshipment points, and Gulf Coast refiners. The legal paperwork on each shipment was clean. Manifests were accurate. Cargo was declared. Port fees were paid on time. The companies maintained adequate insurance, held proper flag registrations, and filed all required documentation with the Coast Guard. The money, though, moved differently than the cargo. Revenue from petroleum sales, estimated at $2. $3 billion over the 19-month period. Didn't flow back to the shell companies through standard correspondent banking channels. It moved through a layered series of trade finance instruments. Letters of credit issued by 3 small financial institutions in the United Arab Emirates and 1 in Turkey, denominated in euros and Emirati dirhams, routed through a series of intermediary accounts held in Luxembourg and Cyprus. By the time the funds reached accounts nominally held by the Marshall Islands entities, they had passed through no fewer than 7 correspondent banking relationships, none US-based and none individually large enough to trigger automated compliance alerts. One detail stood out in the forensic accounting work completed in May 2026. I spent time reviewing the case documentation, and a single footnote in the OFAC analysis kept drawing my attention. Of the $2, $3 billion in total revenue estimated to have passed through the network, approximately $180 million had been traced, through a secondary layer of financial transfers, to 2 procurement entities operating in the Gulf region that were known IRGC logistics arms. Those entities had been identified in separate treasury designations as suppliers to Houthi maritime operations in the Red Sea. The same funds that moved petroleum through Gulf of Mexico ports were being used, downstream, to equip forces attacking U.S. Navy vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. That connection, from a mailbox suite in Wilmington, Delaware, to attacks on U.S. military ships, is what turned Operation Dry Harbor from a financial crimes case into a national security priority. It's also what almost sank the investigation before it reached trial. In early May 2026, the HSI team coordinating the case learned that a federal grand jury in the Southern District of Texas had been convened to hear evidence on a separate maritime fraud matter, a case with overlapping subjects. There was a risk that the 2 proceedings, running in parallel, would alert targets before Dry Harbor was ready to execute. The task force had to pause its own grand jury process for 18 days while prosecutors worked through the coordination problem. 18 days in which the tankers kept moving. 18 days in which the money kept flowing. Obi Stackle Onu. That was the first time it looked like the case might fall apart. The second came 11 days later. The American facilitators, the domestic nodes that made the network function inside U.S. borders, were not anonymous figures. They were professionals. Established reputations, professional licenses, decades of experience in maritime commerce. 7 of them would be arrested on the morning of July 8, 2026. The most significant was James Calloway, 58, a former Admiralty attorney based in Houston who had practiced maritime law for 22 years before moving into what he described on his professional profile as maritime business consulting. Calloway had served as the U.S. side registered agent for 4 of the 14 shell companies. He had helped establish the corporate structures, selected the nominee directors, and advised on the flag registration strategy that kept the tankers operating under Marshall Islands Registry while conducting commerce in U.S. ports. According to the federal indictment, Calloway received $3, $4 million in consulting fees paid through a Cypriot intermediary between January 2025 and April 2026. By all available accounts, he had done nothing overtly illegal in the ordinary sense. He had not moved contraband. He had not forged documents. He had not bribed anyone. He had provided legal and business infrastructure services to companies he had reason to know were controlled by sanctioned foreign nationals, and had structured those services carefully enough to maintain plausible deniability for 19 months. 2 other American facilitators were port logistics directors. Marcus Webb, 44, at a terminal management company operating within the Port of Houston complex, and Elena Costello, 51, who held a senior operations role at a cargo handling firm with contracts at both Barbers Cut Terminal and the Port of Beaumont. Webb and Costello had facilitated the expedited berthing, cargo documentation, and discharge scheduling for tankers operated by the shell companies, accepting payments. Described in HSI financial records as consulting retainers, routed through a Florida LLC that served as an intermediary. The remaining 4 defendants held operational roles in the logistics chain. a freight forwarder, a customs broker, and 2 individuals who managed day-to-day communications between the U.S. side entities and the overseas financial infrastructure. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Every one of these 7 individuals had undergone standard maritime industry background checks. Everyone held professional credentials that required ongoing compliance certifications. Several had previously worked in or adjacent to federal regulatory agencies. The network wasn't built around outsiders. It was built around insiders who understood exactly how much pressure the U.S. sanctions compliance architecture could bear before it triggered an alert, and they had calibrated their exposure accordingly. What strikes me about this case isn't the sophistication of the scheme. Maritime sanctions evasion through shell company structures is, at this point, a documented playbook. What's notable is how long it ran without drawing institutional attention, and why it ultimately took a single mid-level compliance analyst at an insurance firm, someone entirely outside the formal regulatory perimeter, to be the one who noticed. The formal financial intelligence apparatus had the pieces. The SAR data was there. The beneficial ownership registries existed. The correspondent banking records were technically accessible to the relevant agencies. What wasn't there, apparently, was the right combination of attention, cross-referencing, and follow-through, until Sandra Pruitt put it together herself on a Tuesday afternoon and filed a 9-page report she wasn't required to file. Worth saying plainly, the fact that a private insurance compliance analyst saw this before FinCEN's own automated systems flagged it is a systemic failure, not a success story. The network ran for 19 months. The infrastructure for detecting it existed. Something in how that infrastructure actually functions, in practice, allowed $2, $3 billion in sanctions-evading transactions to move through U.S. ports across 19 months without generating a consolidated alert. That gap, between the stated capacity of the compliance architecture and its demonstrated performance, deserves more scrutiny than the arrests. Investigators working Operation Dry Harbor spent 11 weeks, from March 26th through June 9th, 2026, building the evidentiary record that would support simultaneous seizure warrants across 3 ports. The work involved 4 interacting analytical tracks. The first was beneficial ownership mapping, establishing, through corporate registry records in Marshall Islands, Panama, and Belize, combined with financial forensics conducted jointly with OFAC, that all 14 shell companies traced to Jalili and Kavusi. This was complicated by the deliberate use of multiple nominee director layers and the routing of corporate communications through encrypted messaging platforms. HSI financial analysts used transaction correlation analysis, matching payment flows, communication timing, and corporate filing dates, to establish the linkages that nominee structures were designed to obscure. The second track was vessel movement documentation, using AIS transponder data, port entry and exit records, and Coast Guard vessel inspection reports to establish the operational history of all 14 tankers. This analysis produced a detailed record of routes, cargo declarations, and berthing patterns going back to November 2024, the point at which the first shell companies had been incorporated. The third track was financial forensics, tracing the $2, $3 billion revenue estimate through the layered letter of credit and correspondent banking infrastructure used to move funds from petroleum sales back to the beneficial owners. This was the most technically complex element of the investigation, and it required coordination with financial intelligence units in the UAE, Luxembourg, and Cyprus. Coordination that required diplomatic channels and took longer than the domestic elements of the case. The fourth track was the domestic network, identifying, through surveillance, financial record analysis, and a limited number of consensually monitored communications, the 7 American facilitators and documenting their specific roles in the scheme. OB Stakeled TWO. The surveillance element of the domestic network track produced one serious complication. In late April 2026, one member of the investigative team, an HSI analyst assigned to the web surveillance thread, made a procedural error that temporarily compromised the integrity of a monitoring authorization. The error was identified internally. It required a 48-hour operational pause while prosecutors reviewed the affected records to determine what, if anything, had been obtained improperly. The determination was that the compromised authorization had produced no evidence that wasn't independently obtained through other authorized means. The investigation continued. But the pause cost time, and it introduced a period of uncertainty about whether the web evidence strand would survive a suppression motion at trial. It would, but the team didn't know that yet in late April. During the same period, agents conducting physical surveillance on web's daily movements documented something that would prove significant at trial. Over a 31-day window in April and May, Webb met in person with Callaway on 6 separate occasions: at a restaurant in Midtown Houston, at a private parking facility near the Galleria, and twice at Callaway's office building on a weekend when the building's access logs showed no other tenants present. The meetings weren't recorded, but each was photographed at range using long lens equipment deployed by a 2-person HSI surveillance unit. The photographs placed the 2 men together in settings consistent with operational coordination, meetings that Webb's own phone records showed had not been preceded or followed by any calls between the 2 men. They were meeting in person specifically to avoid creating a communications record. Prosecutors would later describe those photographs as among the most useful pieces of evidence in the entire case file. The detail that defined the operational timeline came in June. By June 9, 2026, the evidentiary record was complete enough to support federal seizure warrants under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the sanctions enforcement provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act. The warrants were presented to the Southern District of Texas and the Southern District of Georgia simultaneously. They were signed on June 23, 2026. The operational question was timing. 14 tankers across 3 ports, multiple defendants across 2 states. The seizure operation had to be simultaneous. If any one element moved early, targets could be alerted, evidence could be destroyed, and tankers could depart U.S. waters before warrants could be executed. HSI coordinated with the Coast Guard's maritime law enforcement arm to ensure that no vessel from the targeted fleet could clear port in the window between the first and last warrant executions. 1 tanker, designated internally as Target 11, the Crescent Meridian, registered in the Marshall Islands, presented a specific logistical problem. As of July 5, 2026, 3 days before the planned execution date, the Crescent Meridian had completed cargo discharge at Barber's Cut and was scheduled to depart on the morning of July 8th, potentially before the simultaneous operation could be coordinated across all 3 ports. The Coast Guard issued an administrative hold on the vessel's departure clearance, citing a routine documentation discrepancy. The hold bought 48 hours. The Crescent Meridian was still at dock when the warrants executed. That was not the only obstacle in the final 72 hours. O.B. Stakel T.H. Ree. On the evening of July 6, 2026, James Callaway's attorney made contact with the Southern District of Texas U.S. Attorney's office to inquire about the status of a grand jury subpoena that had been issued to Callaway in connection with what the attorney described as a maritime compliance matter. The inquiry was handled carefully. Prosecutors confirmed only that a grand jury was active and declined to provide any detail. But the contact itself indicated that Callaway, or someone in his network, had become aware that federal attention was focused in his direction. The task force moved the operation date forward by 4 hours and placed physical surveillance on all 7 defendants beginning at 11 p.m. on July 7th. The overnight surveillance hours were tense in a specific way that case veterans describe as distinct from the anxiety of an operation itself. It's the waiting. Watching a target move through an ordinary evening routine, knowing they don't yet know what the morning holds, that agents consistently describe as the most psychologically demanding phase of an enforcement action this size. One HSI surveillance officer posted outside Callaway's residence in the Memorial neighborhood described watching him walk his dog at 10:47 p.m., return inside, and turn his lights off by 11:30. Callaway slept. The surveillance team did not. At 5:47 a.m. on July 8, 2026, 14 federal vehicles moved along the service road at Barber's Cut Terminal in Houston. At 5:51 a.m., the single word, execute, went out simultaneously to all 3 port locations. At Barber's Cut, HSI agents and Coast Guard maritime law enforcement officers boarded all 7 tankers docked at the terminal within a 22-minute window. Physical seizure notices were posted on each vessel. Crew members were directed to remain aboard and were informed of the federal action. No crew member was placed under arrest. The criminal charges were directed exclusively at the U.S.-based facilitators, not the vessel's operating crews, who were treated as witnesses rather than targets. Several crew members, according to HSI boarding reports, indicated through interpreters that they had no awareness of the ownership structure behind the companies that employed them. Their accounts were documented and will form part of the government's evidence base in the civil forfeiture proceedings. In Savannah, the operation at the Port of Savannah's Garden City Terminal ran with similar precision. 4 tankers were boarded. 1. The Eastern Venture, Target 9, required a longer boarding approach due to its berth position at a secondary dock, but the boarding was completed by 6:14 a.m. local time. At Long Beach, 3 tankers were boarded at the Pier T facility beginning at 5:51 a.m. Pacific time, 8:51 a.m. Eastern. The Long Beach operation was the most logistically complex, involving coordination with the Port of Long Beach Harbor Patrol and a larger HSI ground team, but it concluded without incident. Simultaneously with the port operations, arrest teams moved on all 7 defendants. James Calloway was taken into custody at his residence in the Memorial neighborhood of Houston at 6:03 a.m. He was, according to HSI records, in the process of making coffee. Marcus Webb was arrested in the parking structure of his office building in Pasadena, Texas, at 6:09 a.m. Elena Costello was taken at her home in Beaumont at 6:22 a.m. The remaining 4 defendants were arrested across 2 Texas locations and 1 in Florida. All 7 were in custody by 7:47 a.m. Would you have spotted it before the raid? Drop a comment. When did you realize how deep this network actually ran? By 9 a.m., OFAC had formally designated all 14 shell companies as blocked entities. The designation simultaneously froze any U.S. held financial assets associated with the entities. Total frozen. $340 million across accounts held at 4 U.S. financial institutions. The tankers themselves, 14 vessels with an estimated combined market value of approximately $210 million, were placed under federal administrative seizure pending civil forfeiture proceedings. The arrests were announced publicly at noon. The Department of Justice held a joint press conference with the Department of Homeland Security and the Treasury Department. The case was described as the largest maritime sanctions enforcement action since the seizure of the Iranian supertanker Grace 1 in 2019. The comparison holds in terms of scale. What both the 2019 action and the 2026 action shared, beyond raw numbers, was the same underlying dynamic. In both cases, sophisticated sanctions, evasion infrastructure had operated for an extended period before being disrupted. And in both cases, disruption had required extraordinary coordination across agencies and jurisdictions. Sandra Prewitt's name was not mentioned at the press conference. It was not in the initial DOJ press release. It appeared once in a footnote of the federal indictment, identified only as a financial compliance professional employed by a maritime insurance firm. The indictment credited the SAR filing as the initial trigger for the investigation, noted its 9-page scope, and moved on. One detail that stays with me from the case file. Prewitt's compliance director had told her to document the suspicious agent address and move on. She documented it and filed the SAR anyway. The network had been running for 19 months at that point. It ran for another 11 weeks while the investigation was built. In total, an estimated $3 billion passed through the structure over the life of the operation. How much of that would have continued moving if she had simply done what she was told is a question the case file does not answer. The 7 defendants face federal charges under IEPA, the Trading with the Enemy Act, and the International Emergency Economic Powers Sanctions Enforcement provisions, as well as conspiracy charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 371. Maximum statutory penalties range from 20 years for the primary conspiracy charges to additional terms for the sanctions violations. Calloway's attorney indicated shortly after arrest that his client intends to contest the charges on the grounds that his role constituted legal services exempt from sanctions liability under the Berman Amendment. Legal scholars consulted by federal reporters described that argument as facing significant obstacles given the scope of the indictment. Trials have not yet been scheduled. Farhad Jalili and Mehdi Kavusi remain outside U.S. jurisdiction. Interpol notices have been issued. Both men are believed to be in Iran. Neither faces any prospect of extradition in the near term. Of the $3 billion estimated to have passed through the network over 19 months, $340 million has been frozen in U.S. accounts. The remaining $1, $96 billion in revenue, and the downstream funds traced toward IRGC-linked procurement entities have not been recovered. They are not expected to be. 2 individuals identified by HSI financial analysts as secondary facilitators, domestic nodes in the network who provided financial services to the shell companies, were not among the 7 arrested on July 8th. Federal prosecutors declined to comment on whether additional charges are pending. The investigation remains formally open. The operational disruption to the petroleum flow the network managed is expected to be temporary. The demand the network served, Iranian crude moving through intermediary structures to reach markets that purchase it in violation of U.S. sanctions, has not changed. The infrastructure for meeting that demand exists in multiple jurisdictions, involves dozens of entities, and has proven capable of reconstituting itself after previous enforcement actions. The Crescent Meridian, the tanker that almost departed before the warrants could execute, is now in federal administrative custody. Its future is pending civil forfeiture proceedings that could take years to resolve. 14 tankers, 14 shell companies, 19 months, 1 compliance analyst, 1 9-page SAR. If you want to know what comes next when federal forfeitures of this scale go to civil proceedings, subscribe. The Crescent Meridian case alone is worth following. The network is dismantled. The demand that created it has not changed. And the 2 men whose names are at the top of every OFAC document in this case are sitting, right now, somewhere beyond reach. The mailbox suite in Wilmington, Delaware is still there.